Hi quilters, this is Ashley Montgomery with Quilt to End ALZ, and this is block 2 for the month of February in our 2022 fleeting block of the month. All right, so our second month is going to build off what we did in January, and that is using our square in square technique. So this month's block is a 9 patch, and each of the 9 patches is made up of a square in square. I'm going to show it to you close up here. Now, if you didn't download this, I really recommend that you print off the first page of the January instructions. This has our fabric requirements, and as the pattern goes through and labels things as fabric A, B, C, D, and E, you can make a little cheat sheet, which is what I've done for our sample quilt, but also for my personal quilt that I'm making. I find that it is so easy to have that. So if you just take a look there, I just put a little zigzag stitch to make sure it stays in place, and I also made myself a little note on the page. That way when we're going through each month's instructions, it's so simple to know which colors we're using. And of course I'm using these solids for our sample quilt. If you're using prints, you're always going to put your fabrics together right sides facing when you make your stitches. With my solids, it doesn't matter because I don't have a right and a wrong side. But make sure you're paying attention to that as you go along. So today's quilt block is going to use 3 of our fabrics. We're going to use C, D, and E. So in our quilt, that is the mint, the off-white, and the dark teal. So what we're going to do is make 5 CD squares, square and square blocks. So we've got the off-white in the center and the mint on the outsides, and then we're going to make 4 CE square and square blocks with the mint on the inside and the dark teal on the outside. So the strategy is going to be exactly the same as what we did last month. All right, here's that close-up of today's block just to show you what it's going to look like. If you didn't want to do square and square blocks, you could always do these with half square triangles. And if you visualize one of these blocks, you could imagine that this could be a half square triangle and these could be half square triangles right there. So that just kind of gives you another way that you could go about putting the block together. But we're going to do the square and square. I like it because I have fewer seam lines going throughout. That also helps minimize the bulk on the quilt. So here are our cutting instructions. In fabric C, again, this is our mint. We are going to make 10 2 7/8 inch squares, and we're going to slice those on the diagonal. We're also going to make 4 3 3/8 inch squares. In the off-white, we're going to make 5 3 3/8 inch squares, and then in the dark teal or fabric E, we're going to make 8 2 7/8 inch squares, and again the 2 7/8 inch get cut on the diagonal. So the great thing about this is that it is wonderful for strip piecing. So let's talk about the steps that we're going to take to create our square. We're going to start with our cream colored square, and we're going to fold it in half one way and just give it a little finger press, and then we're going to fold it in half the other way, and again give that a little finger press. I'll show you close up so you can see. I've created just a little bit of crosshairs on this. Then I'm going to take one of my teal small triangles, and I'm going to line this up on the edge, and that crosshair lets me see exactly where the point needs to go. Now I still pin. If you're a very experienced quilter, you may not feel the need to pin here, and that's great. I just like to because it keeps that point right on my little crease line that I created. And I'm going to sit down and stitch this onto this side of the square. This is where strip piecing would be so easy to do on this quilt. All right, now we're going to do the exact same thing with the mint square. Sorry, my mind went blank for a second. The mint square, and this time we're going to use the dark teal triangles. So again, I'm going to fold it in half and just finger press it, and then go the other direction, and this is going to make my little crosshairs so that I can see where to line the point of my triangle up. And I'm going to go ahead and move our other squares over here so that everything is by the machine. And same thing, we're going to line up along the edge of the fabric, and then we're going to move this point right on the little seam that I made. And again, I'm going to give it a little pin, and I'm going to sew this side also. I'm going to slide my stool out of the way so that I'm not up and down, up and down. Right. If you were making all 9 of your square and squares at one time, you could just sit here and continually feed them through. I've already made mine kind of like a cooking show. I made mine ahead of time so that I could make sure, oh, look what I did. Almost got those too close. In fact, I feel like I did get those too close. Let's see here. All right. There we go. I was too worried about talking and not watching what I was doing as I was quilting. I hope I mentioned the very first month. I am not an expert quilter. I love to quilt, and I noticed back in 2018 I was making a lot of fundraising quilts for Alzheimer's events and benefits, and I noticed that whenever I shared on my Instagram or Facebook a quilt that I was making as an Alzheimer's fundraiser, or perhaps using some of the fabric that my grandmother, who we lost to Alzheimer's, passed down to me, I noticed how many quilters had an Alzheimer's story and were looking for ways to connect and to heal through that journey. And so I merged my advocacy work and my calling to Alzheimer's and my love of quilting, and I use this platform as an opportunity to educate quilters on Alzheimer's and dementia and what we can do as a collective voice. And the number one thing that we can do is to be there for one another. And so I love that about this Block of the Month program, this Quilt Along. We have people literally from all over the world. We have people from Europe and the States and Canada, and I'm just having so much fun seeing us come together to quilt. We say that we're quilting to mend the mind. I love when people say that quilting is a form of therapy for them. I agree completely, and I love that we're doing this together. All right, so right now we have 2, or if you've chain pieced all of them, you're going to have 9 of them. And right now you've got your triangles on the opposite sides of each square. So at this point we need to press. So I'm going to grab my iron here. And remember from last month, we always want to set the iron down on the piece that we've just sewn, just to set the threads. The heat, it causes the thread just to contrast up and to shrink just, I mean, a minute little tiny bit, but it does help to set those stitches in place. So once we lay that on there, just let the heat hit it for just a second. Then we're going to open these up, and I like to just very gently fold that over, and then we are pressing and not ironing. We talked about this last month. We're just setting the weight and the heat of the iron on top of it, letting it sit for 2 to 3 seconds. And I like to get the other one ready while I'm letting that sit for a second. And then I'm going to turn this around and do the same thing. And same thing here. We're going to turn this around. We're going to slide this triangle back and just kind of find its place very gently. We don't want to push the fabric or manipulate it in any way. Perfect. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing on the opposite two sides of our center block. So if you pressed out your crease, you can put it back in there so that you have your guideline of where to place the points of your triangle. And we'll lay this out. Again, I'm going to pin, totally up to you. It's funny, there are some quilt patterns and projects that I feel like I don't do a lot of pinning, and then there are some that I just have to be really precise, and it never turns out perfectly. I never ever get the same perfect result I mean, hardly ever at all, but certainly never more than once. All right, we're going to stitch that triangle on. We're going to do the same thing with our dark teal triangle, and I did press my guideline out a little bit, so I'm going to finger press that back in there. Make sure I can see where to set my triangle. You can see how it's nice to put on some music or a book, or you know, just something that you can relax and enjoy the strip piecing, because this block comes together so nicely, so easily. Right, and then we're gonna do the exact same thing on the other side. Oh, and look, I said I was gonna pin and I didn't. Like I said, totally up to you. All right, last side here, gonna line that up just right. Put that pin in there. And our last little piece here. I have had so much fun seeing all of your blocks from January. If you haven't shared them with us, you could certainly do that by tagging us on social media. If you share it with your friends and family, we're at Quilt, the digit 2, END-ALZ on all social media platforms. But we would love for you to join us in our Facebook group. It's called Quilting to Mend the Mind, and it's the perfect place to share your blocks and everything that we're putting together here. It's a great place to connect to. All right, so let's go ahead and set the threads. And then we'll get this ready. Press it back. Now, these are all going to finish up at 4.5 inches. So whenever you get ready, after you've pressed it and you get ready to start putting your rows together for your 9-patch block, you want to make sure that you have trimmed these down. And so I like to use a small square ruler. It's exactly 4.5. And just to make sure that I've got my points where they're supposed to be, I actually go ahead and line my ruler up with the points in my square. So the top point and the bottom square of the inner square here. And that's what I use to make sure that I keep my squares squared. That's a mouthful right there. All right, so let's do that part. Right, again, I'm going to show you under the overhead camera here what I'm talking about. But on your ruler, you want this point to be at the 2 1/4 and 1/4 inch down. So it's that little spot right there. And then on this other side, my particular ruler has a little black dot that the 2 1/4 and 1/4 inch away from the seam. So ideally, these two spots are going to be the top and bottom intersection that creates your diagonal on that square. So I'm going to slide over here to my cutting board, and I'm going to use those markings that I just showed you, and I'm going to trim these squares up. All right, all done. I now have 4 of these dark square and square blocks, and I have 5 of the cream and mint. So we're going to lay those out into our 9 patch. So let's come over here, and I'm going to slide that up just a little bit so you can see it pretty well. So we're going to start with a light and a dark and another light, and we're just going to lay this exactly how it is in the instructions. If you are very particular, you might notice that you have an overlap that goes one way or the other. You can lay that out whatever makes the most amount of sense for you. And then we're going to sew them together, and we're going to sew across the top row, across the middle row, and then across the bottom row, and that's going to create our 3 strips. And I like to always press towards the dark fabric. You could also open it up if you wanted to, but I think that because we've got this checkerboard, if you always press towards the dark, then you're going to be able to sandwich these seams really well. So again, once you have those strips all sewn together, it's going to look just like this. It's our 9 patch, and each patch is a square and a square. I can't wait to see the fabrics that you've chosen, and please make sure that you post your blocks and encourage one another, reach out to one another. That's what we're all about, is building a community that's here for one another. Make sure that you email also if you have any questions or any concerns at all, and thanks for being with us on our very first Block of the Month program for 2022. Time is fleeting. We're taking it one stitch at a time. Thank you.